nicely and wouldn't forage the Union, wouldn't damage Union territory. In the meantime, the Union came in and tore up everything. General Sherman went through Atlanta and burned the whole city down. Some of you may have heard this. Burnt the city to the ground, and guess what? The Union Army won. I mean, if you don't like what I'm saying, I don't like it either. But the British treated the colonials at times too nicely. The British would not forage. The British did not realize that war in the colonials was not a seasonal activity. War could be fought. It wasn't just that Washington captured a bunch of Hessians on New Year's Eve, but George Rogers Clark, who was a colonel, went into the Northwest Territory and took the Northwest Territory, what amounts to the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, took several forts in the region in the wintertime. While the British were celebrating, thinking no army was within miles, he would slip in, burst the door open, and here we are, we're British, hauled down the British flag. He told the British at one point, go on with your merrymaking, but you're now prisoners of war, you're subject to Virginia now and not subject to the king. So this was, and by the way, because of his efforts, and also Daniel Boone, because of what he did, Kentucky was given, Tennessee was given to the colonials when the war ended, largely to the efforts of Daniel Boone. Why did the British lose? The French, if we look what the French did, the French helped the colonies greatly. The people in charge of the colonies fled back to England. The governors, the judges, all fled back to England when the rebellion started. And the British could not be everywhere at once. All right. So much for chapter 7 for now. Oh yeah, I wanted to just mention one other thing. After the Battle of Yorktown, by the way, the last battle was Yorktown. The diplomats went to France to work up a peace. Thomas Jefferson went along. Ben Franklin's already there. The treaty they worked out was the Treaty of Paris. Now don't get confused, there were two treaties of Paris. The one in 1763 that ended the French and Indian War, the one in 1783. In the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Great Britain decided to give the colonies their independence. Great Britain gave the colonies all the territories south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi River. France did get something for it. France received the island of Hispaniola, but they didn't get back Canada. And eventually the French got the territory west of the Mississippi River. They got it in a deal from Spain. But so the French did get some territory for their winnings. Anyway, Treaty of Paris, 1783. And like I say, Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin helped work up the treaty. Then Ben Franklin came home for good. Thomas Jefferson also came home for good. All right. With that, now I'm about to give you a break, but I do want to start chapter 8 first. We haven't been here quite, but we've been here more than an hour, okay. Long class, folk, and if you think it's long, I've been going for 4 hours already. So. All right, I'll move on. Building Republic. With the opening vignette is James Madison. All right, for what little this is worth, the high school I attended was Madison High School, named after James Madison. James Madison is called the father of the Constitution. He's the one who wrote much of the Constitution, and a lot of what he wrote is still in the Constitution today, as we'll talk about in a little bit. James Madison was the father of the Constitution. As a young man, he didn't have any direction in life. He didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. He finally joined the Army as best he could. He was a little man. In fact, of our presidents, he was the smallest president we had. Little man. But he became the 4th president of the United States. But he was the one who wrote our Constitution at the Constitutional Convention in Annapolis. But before the Constitution was written, we're under a series of documents called the Articles of Confederation. I wish I... Bear with me. I'm going to see if I can get that eraser from the next screen. They did not lock the door. Okay, I've got it. Okay. Someone finally wrote down the set of laws that we should be governed by, because they felt like you have to have a legal document to have a government. So they called this the Articles of Confederation, and that was what we're under the first 10 years. Now, folk, it has been said that you can win the war and lose the peace. We almost did just that. For the first 10 years, things were so confused in our country that a lot of persons wished we were back under Great Britain because it felt like the colonials did not know how to govern themselves. The Articles of Federation were so weak, they could not raise taxes. They had to depend on whatever the states chose to give them. They could not make treaties, and if they made one, they could not enforce it. And one British diplomat came over here to make a treaty, and he said, should I make one treaty with you, or should I make 13 treaties, one with each state? He was being facetious. Actually, though, he should have made 13 treaties because the articles were too weak. Couldn't raise taxes. You might say, how did they survive? Well, they survived in part because 7 of the states, they're now states, 7 of the states had lands that went to the Mississippi River, including states like New York and even Georgia. Georgia claimed some land to the Mississippi River, and Virginia certainly did. And in fact, New York and Virginia sometimes claimed the same land. Well, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson gave up Virginia's land west of the Ohio River, and the other states followed. So the Congress got these western lands, and they sold these western lands, and they raised money that way. That helped, but that was not going to last forever. A lot of your richer people in the colonies began to worry that the central government was not strong enough to protect them, was not strong enough to keep people from taking their property. And they also had a provision, and folks, this was a mistake that Poland made, that in order for the Articles to be changed, every colony had to agree. Well, they got up a tax law one time, and 12 of the colonies agreed and one didn't, so the tax law did not become a law. We realize it's almost impossible to achieve unanimity on anything, and I keep wondering how long before we finally decide that juries should be able to decide a case 10-2 rather than try to get unanimous votes. I served on a jury twice, but one time we had a lady on a jury who held out and held out, and we sat there for an hour while one of the women tried to persuade her to vote along with the rest of us. She finally did. I could go into more detail, but anyway, some juries, they have to have a mistrial because they become hopelessly deadlocked to the point where just one person can hold out and keep the jury deadlocked. Anyway, the people who were elected to serve in the Continental Congress under the Articles oftentimes would not show up. They felt like it wasn't important. Absenteeism was so high that Congress often could not even do business. In short, things were going badly. People considered themselves Virginians or New Yorkers or Pennsylvanians. They did not consider themselves part of the central government. The central government just appeared too weak. So, and by the way, this was to go on for many generations. during the Civil War, men like Robert Lee and Stonewall Jackson, both of them Virginians, decided to fight for the South because they were Virginians. But in the meantime, one of their buddies, the man named General Thomas, was a Virginian who fought for the North. So, but most people were more loyal to those states than they were to the central government. And this was especially true during the time period that we're talking about here. All right. Every state had a couple of things in common, though. They all had, at first, that you had to be a property owner in order to vote. Now, you might wonder, why was this? Here's why, folk, and I'm not going to cover it up. They only believed that your more successful people should be involved in government, and your people who were not successful, basically the poor. They did not want the poor having a part or a voice in government. So people who were too poor to own property were denied the vote. And this was to stay in some state constitutions all the way up to the 1840s. And even to the 1880s and 1890s, you had to be a property owner in some states in order to serve on a jury. Now that law is no longer on the books in any states now. It's since been declared unconstitutional. But they did not want the poor people to have a vote. All right, folks, it's 1:25. Be back at 1:35.
He said it.
Yes.
I was looking through my notes and I couldn't tell what I had written. But what year was St. Augustine discovered?
It was built in 1590, I believe, 17 years before Jamestown.
Okay.
So that makes it the oldest. But St. Augustine, we often don't count it because it was a Spanish town and not a colonial, not an English town. The oldest English town is Jamestown, Virginia, the oldest one that lasted. There was another one at Roanoke that didn't last.
But it's still considered the first permanent colony.
The first permanent English settlement is Jamestown, but the oldest city is St. Augustine. Now, we may find out that some of these New Mexican settlements might have been built before 1590, but the records are scarce. The records that they wrote on were the records they kept. Some of them have been destroyed, and some of them are being slowly and gradually dug up as we find old attics or old library places in libraries, or dig up old vaults, and find some papers that might show that some of the New Mexico, and New Mexico at that time included Arizona. It was later split into. Yes, New Mexican history is included because it is part of the United States. Okay, I think most of you are back. Under the articles, there was some headway made in some places on the issue of slavery. The territory of Vermont outlawed slavery first, but the problem was Vermont was not considered a state at the time. New York and New Hampshire both claimed Vermont. Now today, eventually Vermont got its independence, but for the people of Vermont wanted to claim that they were free from both New York and New Hampshire, which they eventually became. But Vermont was not recognized as one of the 13 original colonies. So, but they outlawed slavery first. Then the state of Massachusetts outlawed slavery by court decisions. The Massachusetts top court consistently voted against slavery every time a slave case came up until for all practical purposes. But the first state to outlaw slavery by actual mandate, by act of legislature, was Pennsylvania. But even then, the emancipation was gradual. Pennsylvania passed a law that believed that it was after a certain period of time a slave become free, that a person could only buy a slave and hold him for a certain time period. It might have been 10 years, it might have been 15 or 20, but they could not hold a slave for life. So once their time was expired, all slaves were in Pennsylvania were freed. Now, to make a long story short, eventually your northern states, from Pennsylvania on up, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island and Connecticut, and New Hampshire, all these states eventually outlawed slavery. Until within a few years, slavery did not exist north of the line between Pennsylvania and Maryland. In Delaware and Maryland and Virginia, the three northernmost slave states, bills were introduced to outlaw slavery, but they did not pass. So those states remained slave states. And eventually the gap between slave and free states was to lead to a long 4-year-long bloody war. But now some states ran away. A lot of states living in free states would go to slaves living in slave states would go to a free state, and if they could hide out long enough, they were free. Some of them went all the way to Canada, and to this day, Canada has not a large, but has a noticeable black population. During the Revolutionary War, a lot of slaves ran over to the British, and the British would protect them, and a lot of these slaves then wound up in England or in Canada. And in fact, well, one of our ambassadors, John Jay, went to Britain to try to get the British government to pay for the slaves that were taken. The British government simply refused to do that. So the slaves that the southern people lost during the war were not paid for, were written off as a loss. A lot of these states allowed the slaves to be freed, but in the deep South, the freeing of slaves was unthinkable, particularly in places like South Carolina, and even Georgia, where it was feared that the slaves would outnumber the whites after a while, or the black people would outnumber the whites. And this was true in South Carolina already. North Carolina was not much better. Slavery was too entrenched, and this was especially after the cotton gin was invented. Shortly after it was over, a man named Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, and some people have speculated that if he had not invented the cotton gin, slavery might have died in the South. But all of a sudden, with the cotton gin, slaves could put out many, many more bales of cotton than they could before. If you know anything about growing cotton, the cotton has to be separated from the seed. When done by hand, there was a limit to how much could be done, but then Eli Whitney discovered if you put this cotton over a brush, like a brush type gadget, the brushes will separate the cotton from the seed, and that way they could, a slave could produce 10 times as much cotton in a day with a cotton gin as he could without it. I don't know what to figure. It might have been 10 times, but quite a bit more cotton than he could without it. And the cotton gin is credited with having made slavery popular in the South. Now, of course, cotton could not be grown in the North, so cotton not being grown, slavery did not become popular in the North. So the North had an easier time getting rid of their slaves. Also, the northern people began to understand that slavery was inconsistent with the principles of revolution. The South was reluctant to free them. Now, one of the most famous slave freeings in all of American history occurred with George Washington. George Washington had no children, he and his wife, but he made in his will that when the last of the two of them died, between he and his wife, their slaves would be freed. Well, George Washington died first. Washington died in December 1799, when he spent too much time outdoors and caught pneumonia. His doctor, knowing no more medicine than was available that day, believed that the problem was bad blood in Washington's veins, so he drained a quart of blood from George Washington. George Washington died the next day. Now, this business of draining blood from a sick person was a big problem in the time period we're talking about, folk. I mean, bleeding, it was called bleeding. Bleeding a sick person. And then George Washington killed him. There have been many a case where the persons have been killed with a doctor who might have been better off if they had never gone to a doctor. Don't get me wrong, I go to doctors myself. I went to one just as recently as 2 days ago. So, but doctors sometimes make mistakes. Anyway, George Washington died, and then his wife then took over the plantation. But when she died, all their slaves were freed. Most famous freeing in all of history, or one of the more famous. But a lot of persons did not free their slaves. Eventually, the southern states passed laws that slaves could not be freed. But what a lot of Virginians did was they sold their slaves to Mississippi. This was, I'm jumping ahead of the story a little bit, but they wound up selling their slaves to Mississippi because Virginia was not a good place to grow cotton, and was not a good place for the plantation system, even though they did grow a lot of tobacco in Virginia. Well, the Congress, under the Articles of Federation, found itself in financial problem. They made up an issue of whether to start a bank. Now, folks, this is going to become extremely important. Where there was an issue, and we're going to talk about whether or not the country should have had a bank. In the administration of Washington, he had to deal with it. Jefferson had to deal with it. And then Andrew Jackson, he closed the banks and caused economic chaos. The issue was, should the federal government have a national bank? And a lot of people didn't like it, and a lot of people did. And this was to become a big issue. And where it's to lead is what we have today. The National Bank gave way to the Federal Reserve. And folk, the rest is history with the Federal Reserve. By the way, the place where they met to set the Federal Reserve is right here in Georgia, down in St. Simon's Island. I've been there. You can go to the room and say the top businessmen in the country met right here in this room. And the room does not look impressive at all. It's small in this classroom. But they met in a secret place, and it's like they kind of whispered while they discussed setting up the Federal Reserve. That's highly controversial because the Federal Reserve now regulates prices, controls wages, does a lot to set the value of the stock market, and for all practical purposes issues money, which Congress only should be allowed to do. And some people believe it has too much authority and too much power. But I want to introduce, because this business of whether there should be a national bank started with the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles, the bank did not get very far. But then under George Washington, with his Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, the national bank got a long ways. Again, folks, I've got to digress. When I was at Lockheed, during that time that Lockheed went 5 months without selling an airplane. If it hadn't been for the bank, Lockheed could not have paid us during that time. But Lockheed had accounts with all the local banks, and Lockheed would keep paying us every Friday, all of its workers, salaried and hourly alike, and that kept the economy flowing. But what would it have done to the local economy if Lockheed's employees would not have collected any money for 5 months? Restaurants would have gone out of business. Lockheed employees would have found themselves deep, deep, deep into debt. Then all of a sudden, whammo, whole bunch of cash dumped onto the Marietta economic system. I mean, when the banks keep things running smoothly. We hardly can do without them. Anyway, and most of you, if you buy a car, unless you get really rich, you'll finance it through a lending institution. Without banks, your ordinary person could not afford an automobile. Without banks, your ordinary person could not afford a house.